I'm Audrey Lee, 34 years old, and 6 months ago my entire world collapsed when my husband of 8 years asked for a divorce. The betrayal was devastating, but what my family did next was even worse. If you've ever felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you most, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of profound betrayal. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding how I got here matters. 9 years ago, I was working as a junior software engineer at a tech startup in Austin, Texas, pulling 16-hour days and surviving on gas station coffee and determination. That's where I met Joseph, a charming project manager with kind eyes who always remembered to bring me real coffee from the cafe downstairs. He had this way of making me laugh during the most stressful product launches, and when he asked me to dinner after we'd successfully deployed our first major update, I said yes without hesitation. Our first date was at this tiny Thai restaurant where the owner's cat wandered between tables and the pad Thai was life-changing. Joseph told me about his dream of starting his own consulting firm, and I shared my secret ambition of one day owning a collection of classic cars like my grandfather had. He didn't laugh or call it impractical. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed me photos of a 1967 Mustang he'd been restoring in his garage. The way his face lit up talking about carburetor adjustments and original paint jobs told me everything I needed to know about his character. This was a man who understood passion. We spent the next 3 years building something beautiful together. Joseph's consulting business took off, and my coding skills landed me a senior position at a fintech company with stock options that actually meant something. We moved into a modest house in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Grove, where the homeowners association cared more about lawn maintenance than anyone's business. Our Sunday mornings became sacred. We'd wake up late, make pancakes from scratch while jazz played on the old radio Joseph had inherited from his father, and spend hours in the garage working on whatever project car we'd found that week. I remember the exact moment I knew I wanted to marry him. We just bought a completely ruined 1973 Porsche 911 that most people would have considered scrap metal. As Joseph and I stood in our driveway, covered in grease and arguing good-naturedly about whether the transmission was salvageable, our neighbor Mrs. Patterson commented that we looked like quite the pair of grease monkeys. Instead of being embarrassed, Joseph wrapped his arm around my waist and said, "She's got better instincts with engines than most mechanics I know." The pride in his voice made my heart race faster than any sports car ever could. The golden period of our marriage lasted about 4 years. We'd wake up at 6, share coffee and the morning news, then head to our respective jobs knowing we'd reunite every evening to continue whatever restoration project currently occupied our garage. Joseph's business grew steadily, and my stock options vested just as the company went public. Suddenly, we had real money, not just comfortable living, but the kind of wealth that opens doors you never knew existed. We started attending classic car auctions, not just as dreamers, but as serious buyers. That's when everything changed, though you wouldn't have known it from the outside. Our neighbors saw the same modest house, the same two people who waved hello every morning. What they didn't see was the climate-controlled garage we'd built behind our property, or the fact that our weekend project cars had evolved into something extraordinary. Joseph and I had developed a system. We'd buy cars that looked rough or incomplete to outside observers, restore them to perfection in our hidden garage, then either keep them or sell them to serious collectors. To anyone watching, it looked like we constantly had broken down vehicles cluttering our driveway. The Porsche 911 became a Bugatti Veyron that I'd found at an estate sale. The owner's family had no idea what they had. They just saw an old foreign car that didn't run and wanted it gone. 6 months and $60,000 in restoration costs later, it was worth over $2 million. Then came the 1938 Bugatti Type 57, the 2020 Bugatti Chiron, and eventually a collection that insurance companies valued at over $15 million. But to our neighbors, Joseph and I were just the couple with questionable taste in vehicles and oil stains on their driveway. I loved the secrecy of it. There was something delicious about Mrs. Patterson's disapproving looks when she saw us unloading what appeared to be another junk car, not knowing she was watching us handle automotive art worth more than her entire house. Joseph and I would catch each other's eyes and smile, sharing the knowledge that we were building something incredible right under everyone's noses. We had plans, beautiful plans. Joseph wanted to open a restoration shop that specialized in bringing dead supercars back to life. I dreamed of starting a foundation that would teach automotive skills to underprivileged kids, showing them that working with your hands could lead to both practical skills and profound beauty. We'd mapped out the next 10 years of our lives with the precision we applied to engine rebuilds, and every piece seemed to fit perfectly. But there were signs I missed. small cracks in the foundation that I chose to interpret as temporary stress. Joseph started staying later at the office, claiming new client demands. He began suggesting we sell some of the collection, arguing that we had more money tied up in cars than was practical. When I'd find him staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't read, he'd quickly explain it was work-related. The man who used to spend hours explaining the engineering brilliance of a Bugatti's W16 engine suddenly seemed restless whenever we were in the garage together. The morning everything collapsed started like any other. I was in our hidden garage at dawn doing routine maintenance on the Chiron before Joseph woke up. The engine purred with mechanical perfection, and I was planning to surprise him with a sunset drive through the hill country. I had no way of knowing that in 6 hours, he'd be sitting at our kitchen table with divorce papers, explaining that he'd fallen in love with someone else and wanted to start fresh without the complications of our shared business ventures. But that betrayal, devastating as it was, turned out to be just the beginning. Because when I called my family that night, sobbing and desperate for comfort, I learned something about the people who raised me that changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and what family really means. My parents, Richard and Margaret Chen, had always been practical people who valued stability above passion. They'd tolerated my car hobby the way you might tolerate a child's fascination with dinosaurs, something cute that would eventually be outgrown. My older brother James followed their lead, building a successful accounting practice and a conventional life that our parents held up as the gold standard for adult achievement. My younger sister Michelle had married her college boyfriend and produced the grandchildren our parents doted on, securing her position as the family favorite. I'd always been the outlier, the daughter who chose grease under her fingernails over manicured respectability, who invested in cars instead of mutual funds, who married for love instead of social status. But I thought blood was blood, and when crisis hit, family would rally around family. I was about to learn how naive that assumption was. Growing up, I'd learned to navigate my family's disappointment with careful enthusiasm management. When I bought my first vintage Corvette at 25, I downplayed the purchase price and emphasized the investment potential. When Joseph and I started making serious money from our restoration business, I shared just enough success to avoid lectures about fiscal responsibility while hiding the true scale of our wealth. I thought I was being considerate, sparing them worry about my unconventional choices. Instead, I was setting myself up for the most painful lesson of my adult life. My parents had established a clear hierarchy early in our childhood. James was the responsible one who would carry on the family legacy of practical decision-making. Michelle was the nurturing one who would provide grandchildren and maintain family traditions. I was the wild card, loved but not quite trusted, tolerated but not truly understood. This dynamic had shaped every major decision in my life, from my choice of career to the way I presented my relationship with Joseph to how I managed my newfound wealth. The pattern had been reinforced through countless small moments over the years. When James bought his first house, our parents threw a celebration dinner and contributed to his down payment. When Michelle got engaged, they helped plan and partially fund an elaborate wedding. When I moved in with Joseph, they expressed polite hope that he would be a stabilizing influence on my impractical tendencies. When we bought our first project car together, they reminded me that money spent on toys couldn't be used for more important things like retirement savings or property investments. But I'd also experienced genuine support from unexpected sources. My grandfather, who died when I was 19, had been the one family member who understood my fascination with cars. He'd owned a small collection of classic vehicles and had taught me everything I knew about engines, restoration, and the art of finding diamonds in mechanical rough. His garage had been my sanctuary during teenage years when I felt like an alien in my own family. Joseph's family had embraced me completely, treating my automotive knowledge as a valuable skill rather than an embarrassing quirk. His father, a retired mechanic, and I could talk for hours about the evolution of fuel injection systems. His mother collected vintage jewelry with the same passion I applied to finding rare car parts, and she understood the thrill of discovering something valuable that others had overlooked. With them, I felt celebrated rather than tolerated. My closest friend, Sarah, whom I'd met in college, had been cheering on my car collection from the beginning. She didn't share my mechanical interests, but she understood the joy of building something meaningful with your partner. When Joseph and I started making serious money from our restoration business, she was the one person I could share the full truth with, knowing she'd celebrate our success rather than warn us about the dangers of excessive risk-taking. So when my marriage imploded and I found myself facing the most difficult period of my adult life, I knew exactly who to call for support. My family would help me through this crisis the way families are supposed to help each other. They'd offer emotional support, practical guidance, and the reassurance that I wasn't facing this alone. They'd remind me of my own strength and help me figure out what came next. I had no idea I was about to discover that everything I believed about family loyalty was about to be shattered. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in March when I woke up to find Joseph sitting at our kitchen table with a manila folder and an expression I'd never seen before. The coffee maker was gurgling its familiar morning rhythm. Morning light was streaming through our windows exactly like it had for thousands of other mornings, but something in the air felt wrong. Joseph's hands were folded on top of the folder, and he looked like a man preparing to deliver news that would change everything. "Audrey," he said, and his voice had a formality that made my stomach drop. "We need to talk about our future." The conversation that followed lasted less than 30 minutes, but dismantled 8 years of shared dreams with surgical precision. Joseph explained that he'd fallen in love with someone else, a woman named Jennifer who worked in marketing for one of his clients. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it to be as clean and simple as possible. He suggested we liquidate our car collection, split the proceeds, and go our separate ways without unnecessary complications. I sat there in my pajamas, holding a coffee mug that had suddenly become too heavy for my hands, listening to the man I'd planned to grow old with explain that our entire life together had become an obstacle to his happiness. The folder contained papers he'd already had drawn up, documents that reduced our marriage to a series of asset distributions and custody arrangements for material possessions. "What about the Bugatti collection?" I asked, because focusing on practical details seemed safer than acknowledging the emotional devastation. "That's what I mean about complications," Joseph said. "We both know those cars are worth a fortune, but they're not liquid assets. Jennifer and I want to start fresh, maybe move to California where her family lives. I can't do that with millions of dollars tied up in vehicles that might take years to sell." The casual way he mentioned Jennifer's family, the easy assumption that I'd simply agree to dissolve everything we'd built together, the complete absence of acknowledgement for what this conversation was doing to me, it all hit me like physical blows. But what hurt most was realizing that the cars we'd restored together, the mechanical puzzles we'd solved side by side, the Sunday morning projects that had been the foundation of our intimacy, meant nothing more to him than complicated paperwork standing between him and his new life. I managed to hold myself together until Joseph left for work, kissing my forehead with the same casual affection he'd shown every morning for 8 years, as if he hadn't just detonated our entire relationship over breakfast. Then I collapsed on our kitchen floor and sobbed until my chest ached and my eyes were swollen shut. That's when I reached for my phone and called my mother. "Mom," I said when she answered, "Joseph wants a divorce. He's been having an affair, and he wants to sell our car collection and split everything so he can start over with someone else. I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Well," my mother finally said, her voice carrying none of the comfort I'd been desperate to hear, "I suppose this means you'll finally have to make some adult decisions about your finances." In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of my parents' morning routine, my father's shower running, the coffee grinder my mother used every day at exactly 8:15, the morning news program they watched religiously. Normal life continuing exactly as it always had, uninterrupted by my crisis. "Mom, did you hear what I said? Joseph is leaving me. He's been cheating and he wants to liquidate everything we've built together." "Audrey, you're 34 years old," she replied with the patient tone she'd used to explain why I couldn't have ice cream for breakfast when I was 6. "You can't expect to keep playing with expensive toys forever. Maybe this is an opportunity to finally invest in something sensible, like real estate or a proper retirement fund. James could help you set up a diversified portfolio." I sat on my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. My marriage had just exploded. My heart was shattered, and my mother was offering investment advice. "I need emotional support right now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need my family to help me figure out how to get through this." "Oh, sweetheart," my mother said, and for a moment I thought she was finally understanding. "You'll get through this just fine. You're young, you're attractive, you have a good job. Once you sell those cars and get your finances organized, you'll be in a much better position to find someone more suitable. Someone who shares your values and wants the same kind of stable life you should be building at your age." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but I'd already heard everything I needed to hear. My mother wasn't offering comfort for the loss of my marriage. She was celebrating the end of what she'd always seen as my misguided phase of automotive obsession. My pain was secondary to her relief that I might finally become the conventional daughter she'd always wanted. When I hung up the phone, I sat in my empty kitchen and understood with crystal clarity that I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. The man I'd loved had chosen someone else, and the family I'd counted on saw my crisis as an opportunity to reshape me into their preferred version of who I should be. but I had no idea yet just how much worse it was going to get. 3 days later, my parents arrived unannounced at my house, along with my brother James and his wife Patricia. They found me in the garage, performing therapeutic maintenance on the 1973 Porsche that Joseph and I had restored together. Working with my hands had always been how I processed difficult emotions, and the familiar rhythm of checking fluid levels and testing electrical connections was the only thing keeping me sane. Audrey, my father called from the garage entrance, his voice carrying the authority he'd used throughout my childhood when he was preparing to deliver an important lecture. We need to discuss your situation. I looked up from the engine bay to find my family arranged in a semicircle, all wearing the same expression of concerned determination. James carried a briefcase, Patricia held a legal pad covered with notes, and my parents looked like they were preparing for a difficult but necessary intervention. "I'm fine," I said, wiping my hands on a shop rag. "I'm working through some things, but I'm managing." "Sweetie," my mother said, stepping carefully around a toolbox, "we're worried about you living alone in this big house, surrounded by all these expensive cars. It's not safe, and it's not practical." James opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've been researching the market value of your collection," he said in his professional accountant voice. "Based on current auction results and insurance appraisals, you're sitting on approximately $15 million in assets that are generating zero income and costing you a fortune in insurance and maintenance." I stared at him, trying to understand why my brother was treating my automotive passion like a failed business venture. "These aren't just investments, James. They're cars I restored with Joseph. They're part of my life." "That's exactly the problem," Patricia interjected, consulting her legal pad. "You're emotionally attached to assets that should be working for you. James has calculated that if you liquidate the collection and invest the proceeds conservatively, you could generate enough passive income to support yourself comfortably without ever having to work again." My father stepped forward, and I recognized the expression on his face from every major life decision I'd made that he'd disagreed with. "Audrey, your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to come home for a while. You can sell this house, liquidate the car collection, and move back in with us until you get back on your feet emotionally and financially." The garage suddenly felt too small to contain the weight of what they were suggesting. These people, my own family, were standing in the space where I'd built my dreams and asking me to dismantle everything that made me who I was. "I'm not selling my cars," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "and I'm not moving back home. I'm 34 years old, I have a successful career, and I can take care of myself." James exchanged a look with my parents that made my blood run cold. It was the same look they'd shared when I was 16, and they'd decided I needed structure to curb my rebellious tendencies. "Audrey," my mother said gently, "we love you, but you're not thinking clearly right now. You're traumatized by the divorce, and you're making emotional decisions that could hurt your future. What if Joseph contests the asset division?" Patricia added. "What if he claims that the car collection was primarily his investment and you end up with nothing? You need liquid assets and a clear legal position." I looked around at my family, these people who shared my DNA and my childhood memories, and realized they were treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. Worse, they were acting like my passion for cars, the thing that had brought me the greatest joy and success, was a dangerous delusion that needed to be cured. "Get out," I said quietly. "Audrey," my father started. "Get out of my garage, get out of my house, and don't come back unless you're prepared to support my decisions instead of trying to control them." James closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. "You're making a mistake," he said, "but we'll give you some time to think about it. When you're ready to be reasonable, we'll be here to help." After they left, I sat alone in my garage, surrounded by $15 million worth of automotive art that my family saw as evidence of my poor judgment. For the first time since Joseph had asked for a divorce, I wasn't crying. Instead, I was angry. Angry at Joseph for betraying our partnership, but even angrier at my family for treating my crisis as an opportunity to remake me into their version of an acceptable daughter. But their visit had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. What if they were right about the practical concerns? What if I was being emotional instead of rational? What if keeping the cars was a mistake that would hurt me in the long run? The following week, my sister Michelle called to arrange lunch at our usual place, a cafe downtown where we'd been meeting monthly for years. I thought she might be the one family member who would offer genuine support without trying to fix me. I was wrong. Michelle arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing for traffic while checking her phone for messages from her kids' school. She'd always been the busiest person in our family, juggling her part-time real estate career with raising 3 children under 10. But she'd also been my closest family relationship, the one person who'd never seemed to judge my unconventional choices. "How are you holding up?" she asked, after we'd ordered our usual salads and coffee. "It's been rough," I admitted. "The divorce is going to be complicated, and I'm trying to figure out what my life looks like without Joseph." Michelle nodded sympathetically. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be. 8 years is a long time to build a life with someone." For a moment, I felt the comfort I'd been craving from my family. Michelle understood. She wasn't going to lecture me or try to reorganize my life. Then she leaned forward with the expression she wore when she was about to share important news. "Listen, I've been thinking about your situation, and I might have a solution that could help both of us," she said. "You know how Tim and I have been talking about upgrading to a bigger house before the kids get much older?" I nodded, wondering where this was going. "Well, your house would be perfect for us. The location is great for the school district. There's plenty of room for the kids to spread out, and the property is big enough for Tim to finally have the workshop he's always wanted." I stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. "I know you probably weren't planning to sell right away," Michelle continued. "But think about it. You don't need all that space for just yourself. The maintenance costs must be enormous, and you'd probably get a great price in this market. You could buy a nice condo somewhere more convenient to your work, invest the difference, and not have to worry about all the responsibilities of maintaining such a large property." The conversation continued for another hour, but I'd stopped listening after the first 5 minutes. My sister, the person I'd trusted most in my family, had come to lunch with a real estate acquisition strategy disguised as sisterly concern. She wasn't offering comfort or support. She was offering to solve my crisis in a way that would benefit her family. When I drove home that afternoon, I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, trying to understand how I'd become so disconnected from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My marriage was ending. My parents wanted to control my financial decisions. My brother was treating me like an incompetent client, and my sister saw my crisis as a real estate opportunity. For the first time since Joseph had left, I began to wonder if I really was as alone as I felt. The breaking point came 2 weeks later when my family arranged what they called an intervention, but what felt more like an ambush. They'd coordinated their schedules without consulting me, showing up at my house on a Saturday morning when they knew I'd be working in the garage. This time, they brought reinforcements. James arrived first, followed by Patricia and their teenage daughter Emma, whom they'd apparently briefed about the family's situation. My parents came next, along with Michelle, her husband Tim, and their 3 children. Finally, Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan pulled into my driveway, completing what looked like a small family reunion organized around the singular purpose of fixing my life. I found them assembled in my living room, the adults sitting in carefully arranged positions while the children played quietly in the corner. Someone had brought coffee and pastries, as if this were a social visit instead of what I was beginning to recognize as a carefully orchestrated campaign. "Audrey," my father began, "we've all been talking, and we're concerned about the decisions you're making. We love you," my mother added quickly, "and we want what's best for you." Uncle Robert, who'd always been the family's designated voice of practical wisdom, leaned forward in his chair. "Honey, I've been in business for 40 years, and I've seen what happens when people make emotional decisions about money. Those cars might seem important to you right now, but they're preventing you from building real financial security." Aunt Susan nodded agreement. "When your cousin Rachel went through her divorce, she had to make some difficult choices too. But she listened to the family's advice, simplified her life, and now she's happier than she's ever been." I looked around the room at these people who shared my history and my blood, and realized they'd spent time planning this conversation. They'd assigned roles, prepared arguments, and brought witnesses to demonstrate the collective weight of family opinion. "You all discussed this without me," I said. "We were worried," Michelle explained. "You haven't been returning calls consistently. You're isolating yourself in that garage, and you're refusing to consider practical solutions to your situation." James opened his ever-present briefcase and spread documents across my coffee table. "I've prepared a complete financial analysis," he said. "If you liquidate the car collection and sell the house, you'll have enough capital to buy a reasonable condo, establish a substantial emergency fund, and invest the rest in a diversified portfolio that could support you for life." Patricia pointed to a spreadsheet that showed projected returns and expense calculations. "You could essentially retire at 34, she said. "No more worrying about maintaining expensive cars, no more house payments, no more financial stress." Tim, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up from his position near the window. "The real estate market is perfect for sellers right now. Michelle and I are pre-approved for financing, so you wouldn't have to deal with the uncertainty of finding buyers." I stood up abruptly, unable to sit still while my family carved up my life like a Thanksgiving turkey. "Stop. I said. Just stop talking. The room fell silent, except for the sound of my niece coloring in her book and my nephew quietly playing with toy cars in the corner. You want me to sell my house to Michelle and Tim below market value for their convenience. You want me to liquidate a car collection that I spent 8 years building because you think it's impractical. You want me to move into a condo and live off investment returns like a retiree because that feels safer to all of you than watching me build something with my own hands. We want you to be secure, my mother said. We want you to have a stable future. No, I replied, and my voice was getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. You want me to become someone you're comfortable with? You want me to fit into your definition of what a responsible adult looks like, even if it means destroying everything that makes me happy. Uncle Robert stood up, clearly preparing to deliver what he considered a necessary truth. Audrey, you're 34 years old, and you're acting like a teenager who thinks the world revolves around her hobbies. Those cars are toys, not investments. That garage is a playroom, not a business. It's time to grow up and start thinking about your real future. The words hit me like a physical slap. This man who'd taught me to drive, who'd celebrated my college graduation, who'd attended my wedding, was standing in my living room calling my life's work a childish fantasy. Emma, I said, looking at my 16-year-old niece, what do you want to be when you grow up? She looked up from her coloring book, clearly uncomfortable being drawn into the adult conversation. Maybe a veterinarian? And if you become a veterinarian, and you're successful, and you love your work, but your family thinks you should be an accountant instead because it's more stable, what would you do? Emma glanced nervously at her parents. I guess I'd want to be a veterinarian anyway? That's right, I said, because you get to decide what makes your life meaningful. I turned to face the room full of people who'd known me my entire life, but didn't seem to understand me at all. I'm not selling my cars. I'm not selling my house. I'm not restructuring my life to make you more comfortable with my choices. And if you can't support my decisions, then I need you to leave me alone until you can. The silence that followed was heavy with family dysfunction and disappointed expectations. One by one, they began gathering their things and preparing to leave, their expressions ranging from hurt to frustrated to angry. My father was the last to speak. You're making a mistake, Audrey. When you need us, and you will need us. Remember that we tried to help. After they left, I walked out to my garage and looked at my collection of beautiful machines, each one representing hundreds of hours of careful restoration work and mechanical problem solving. These cars weren't toys or investments or symbols of financial irresponsibility. They were proof that I could take something broken and make it extraordinary. They were evidence of my skill, my patience, and my vision. For the first time since Joseph had asked for a divorce, I felt absolutely certain about something. I would rather be alone with my integrity than surrounded by people who wanted to reshape me into their preferred version of who I should be. But I had no idea that my family was just getting started. 3 days later, the harassment began in earnest. My mother called every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, not to offer emotional support, but to share articles she'd found about the dangers of emotional decision-making during divorce proceedings. My brother started sending emails with subject lines like market analysis, classic car depreciation trends, and urgent tax implications of illiquid assets. Michelle began dropping by unannounced, always with a new argument about why I should reconsider selling the house. But the real escalation came when they started recruiting other people to their cause. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who'd always disapproved of my automotive activities, knocked on my door one morning with a concerned expression and a plate of homemade cookies. Audrey, she said, I hope you don't mind, but your mother called me yesterday. She's worried about you living alone in such a big house with all those expensive cars. I told her I'd keep an eye on you. I stared at this woman who'd complained about every car delivery, every late-night garage session, every deviation from her vision of appropriate suburban behavior, and realized my mother had turned her into a neighborhood spy. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson peered past me toward the garage, where I'd been working on the Porsche earlier that morning. She mentioned that you might be having some financial difficulties because of the divorce. If you need help organizing an estate sale for those cars, my son-in-law works for an auction house. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but the message was clear. My family had decided that if they couldn't convince me directly, they'd use social pressure from the entire neighborhood. The next week, I discovered they'd expanded their campaign to my workplace. I was in the middle of debugging a particularly complex software integration when my manager, Jennifer Kim, stopped by my desk with an unusual request. Audrey, do you have a few minutes to chat privately? She asked. There's something I need to discuss with you. We went to her office, where Jennifer closed the door and looked at me with the somewhat concerned expression I'd been seeing everywhere lately. I got a call yesterday from someone who identified himself as your brother, she said. He was asking about our company's employee assistance program and whether we offer counseling services for people going through difficult personal situations. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. James called my workplace? Jennifer nodded. He seemed very concerned about your emotional state and your ability to make good decisions right now. He suggested that you might benefit from professional support, and he wanted to know if we could encourage you to use our mental health resources. I sat in Jennifer's office, staring at the awards on her wall, and trying to process the fact that my brother had essentially told my boss that I was having a mental breakdown. Jennifer, I want to be clear, I said. I'm going through a divorce, which is stressful but normal. I'm functioning well at work. I'm meeting all my deadlines, and I don't need intervention from my family or my employer. I know, Jennifer said quickly. Your work has been excellent, and I haven't noticed any performance issues. But I had to bring this to your attention because he also mentioned that you might be making some questionable financial decisions that could affect your long-term stability. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, during which I had to reassure my manager that I wasn't having a psychological crisis that would impact my job performance. By the time I returned to my desk, I was shaking with rage at my family's willingness to humiliate me publicly in their effort to control my decisions. That evening, I called my attorney to discuss legal options for stopping the harassment. Audrey, he said, after I'd explained the situation, what your family is doing is frustrating and inappropriate, but it's not technically illegal. They're expressing concern for your welfare, and they have the right to their opinions about your choices. What about my brother calling my workplace? Again, problematic but not illegal. He wasn't making false accusations about your job performance or trying to get you fired. He was expressing concern about your mental health, which is protected speech. I hung up the phone feeling more trapped than ever. My family had figured out how to wage a campaign against my independence without breaking any laws, and they seemed determined to continue until I gave in to their demands. But the final straw came the following Saturday, when I discovered they'd crossed a line I never thought they'd cross. I was in the garage, performing routine maintenance on the Bugatti Chiron, when I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. I looked out to see my parents, James, Michelle, and two people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in a business suit and a younger man carrying a clipboard. They knocked on my front door, and when I answered, my mother stepped forward with an expression of determined compassion. Audrey, we've brought someone to help us, she said. This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a family counselor who specializes in helping people make difficult life transitions. Dr. Mitchell extended her hand with a professional smile. Your family is very concerned about you, Audrey. They've asked me to facilitate a conversation about your current situation and help you explore some options for moving forward. I looked at this stranger standing on my doorstep, invited by my family to psychoanalyze my life choices, and felt something inside me snap. Who are you? I asked the man with the clipboard. I'm Mark Thompson from Premier Estate Services, he said. I understand you have some valuable items that might need professional appraisal and liquidation services. My family had brought a therapist and an estate liquidator to my house. They'd arranged an intervention with professional backup, designed to overwhelm my resistance with expert opinions and practical solutions. Get off my property, I said quietly. Get off my property now, or I'm calling the police. Doctor. Mitchell stepped forward with her trained mediator voice. I understand you're feeling overwhelmed, but your family is offering support. Sometimes we need outside perspective to help us see our situations clearly. I looked at this woman who'd never met me before today, but was prepared to judge my life choices based on my family's concerns. I said, get off my property. All of you. After they left, I sat in my driveway and realized that my family wasn't going to stop. They'd decided I was making a mistake, and they were prepared to use any method necessary to force me into compliance with their vision of appropriate behavior. That's when I decided it was time to fight back. The confrontation I'd been dreading and planning for finally came to a head on a cold December morning, exactly 6 months after Joseph had asked for a divorce. My family had requested a family meeting at my parents' house, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I agreed to attend. But I wasn't going to show up empty-handed or unprepared. I spent the previous week gathering documentation, making phone calls, and preparing for what I knew would be the final conversation about my future. I contacted my financial advisor, my insurance company, and my attorney. I researched comparable sales data for classic cars and real estate in my area. Most importantly, I arranged for backup that would arrive precisely when I needed it most. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood. The same beige carpet, the same family photos lining the hallway, the same sense of middle-class respectability and conventional wisdom. I arrived at exactly 2 o'clock to find everyone already assembled in the living room. My parents, James and Patricia, Michelle and Tim, Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan, and two new faces I recognized from previous encounters. Dr. Mitchell, the family counselor, sat in my father's usual chair with a notepad balanced on her knee. Mark Thompson, the estate liquidator, had spread brochures and business cards across the coffee table like a salesman preparing to close a deal. Audrey, my mother said as I entered the room, "Thank you for coming. We know this has been a difficult time, and we appreciate your willingness to listen to what we have to say." I took a seat on the couch opposite the coffee table, positioned so I could see everyone in the room clearly. "I'm here to listen," I said, "but I'm also here to respond." Dr. Mitchell consulted her notes and began with her professional mediator voice. "Your family has expressed several concerns about your current living situation and financial decisions. They feel that you're isolating yourself, making choices based on emotion rather than logic, and potentially jeopardizing your long-term security." James opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've updated my financial analysis based on current market conditions," he said. "The car collection is actually worth more than we initially estimated, which makes liquidation even more advantageous from a tax perspective." He spread spreadsheets across the table showing